The pine needles beneath Ayana's feet made no sound as she moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the Georgia wilderness. Her father had taught her that, how to walk like wind, how to breathe like shadow. Skills passed down through generations of Cherokee hunters, now reduced to memories and whispers since President Jackson had signed their death warrant 7 years ago. The Indian Removal Act, they called it. As if you could remove a people from their bones, from their blood, from the very earth that had known their names for 1,000 years. She carried a woven basket against her hip, filled with herbs and roots she'd gathered in the hours before sunrise. Bloodroot for fever, wild ginger for Josiah's cough, sassafras for the tea that reminded him of his mother, though he never said so aloud. Words were dangerous things for a man like Josiah, a runaway slave who had dared to claim his own name, his own body, his own future. The cabin came into view through the morning mist that rose from the Chattahoochee River, a structure so hidden among the towering pines and thick undergrowth that even the deer sometimes startled when they passed it. Josiah had built it with his own hands, those same powerful hands that had once forged chains for other men's captivity. The irony was not lost on either of them. Smoke curled from the stone chimney he'd constructed, each rock carefully selected from the riverbed. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. She could smell the cornmeal cakes he was cooking, could picture him standing over the fire, his broad shoulders curved slightly forward. The scars on his back a constellation of cruelty that she traced with her fingers on the nights when thunder made him remember. "You're late," he said when she pushed through the door, but his smile belied any concern. Josiah had a smile that could make flowers grow in winter, rare and precious and worth protecting at any cost. "The bloodroot was deeper in the forest this morning," Ayana replied, setting the basket on the rough-hewn table. "The earth is preparing for winter. Everything pulls inward." He crossed to her, his movements always slightly cautious, as if he expected the world to strike him at any moment. 6 feet of muscle and gentleness, wrapped in skin the color of rich mahogany. His hands, calloused from years at the forge, then months of building their hidden life, cupped her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "We should go deeper west," he said quietly. "Every day we stay, the risk grows." Ayana leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "And every day we run, we lose another piece of ourselves." My people ran. They ran all the way to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and still they died. Thousands of them. My mother, my sisters. Running didn't save them, Josiah. But staying killed them, he countered, his voice rough with emotion. "Baby, I can't lose you because I was too stubborn to keep moving." She opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him. The fear that lived in the corners of his mouth. The love that burned in his dark eyes like lantern light in a storm. The impossible choice he made every morning, stay with her and risk capture or leave her and die inside. "Then we make this place a fortress," she said firmly. "We prepare. We survive. Together." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. She was small, barely 5 feet, with long black hair that she kept braided tight against her skull. But there was nothing delicate about Ayana. She had walked the Trail of Tears at 14, had buried her family in frozen ground, had survived on roots and rage, while white men watched her people die. "Together," he echoed, the word a prayer and a promise. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes when two people have learned each other's rhythms, when words become optional. Through the single window, Ayana watched the forest come alive. Squirrels chattering in the oaks, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, the endless green of Georgia wilderness that had become both sanctuary and prison. After breakfast, Josiah went to check his traps, while Ayana worked on treating a deer hide she'd been preparing for weeks. She used a mixture of brain and water, working it into the skin with patient circular motions. Her grandmother had taught her this, back when the Cherokee nation still existed as more than a ghost story, back when being Indian was a heritage instead of a crime. The work was meditative, allowing her mind to wander through the labyrinth of their situation. They'd been here for 8 months now, since that night Josiah had appeared at the edge of Cherokee territory, bleeding, desperate, more dead than alive. She'd found him collapsed near the river, his back torn open from a whipping, fever burning through him like wildfire. She should have let him die. That's what any sensible person would have done. Helping a runaway slave was dangerous enough. Falling in love with one was suicide. But Ayanna had stopped being sensible the day she'd watched her mother freeze to death on a forced march, the day she'd realized that the law was just another word for cruelty, dressed in patriotic colors. So she'd dragged him to her small shelter, had cleaned his wounds with water boiled over hidden fires, had fed him herbs and hope until the fever broke and he opened his eyes. And in those eyes, she'd seen something she recognized, a refusal to accept the world's verdict on his worth. "My name is Josiah," he'd whispered, the words coming slow and thick. "Not boy, not property, Josiah." "Ayanna," she'd replied. "It means eternal blossom." "That's fitting," he'd said, managing the ghost of a smile. "You just brought me back from the dead." The sound of dogs barking in the distance jerked Ayanna from her memory. Her hands froze on the deer hide, every muscle in her body suddenly tense. Dogs. Multiple dogs. And beneath their baying, the low rumble of men's voices. She moved to the window, peering through the gap in the wooden shutters. Nothing yet, but the sounds were getting closer, moving through the forest with purpose. These weren't random hunters passing through. These were men with a mission. Ayanna's heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a cold, crystalline clarity that she'd felt only once before, on the day she'd held her dying mother and realized that mercy was sometimes just another form of cowardice. She crossed to the corner of the cabin, where Josiah kept his tools, hammers and chisels and iron rods from his blacksmith days, and reached past them for the weapon that hung on 2 pegs behind. Her father's tomahawk. It was a beautiful thing, despite its deadly purpose. The handle was carved from hickory, worn smooth by generations of hands. The blade was steel, traded from white settlers 100 years ago, kept sharp through decades of use. Along the handle, her father had carved symbols, Cherokee syllabary that spelled out their family name, symbols of protection, a prayer to the spirits of forest and river. The weight of it in her hand felt like coming home. The door burst open and Josiah stumbled in, his eyes wide with panic. "Ayanna, they're coming. 5 men, maybe 6. Professional trackers by the look of them. Dogs trained to smell." He stopped, seeing the tomahawk in her hands. "No, no, baby. We run. We run right now." "Where?" she asked calmly. "They have dogs, Josiah. They have horses. They have the law on their side and murder in their hearts. We run, they catch us in the open. We stay, we choose our ground." "They'll kill you," he said desperately, crossing to her, his hands reaching for hers. "Or worse, you know what they do to Indian women who help runaways. You know." She did know. She'd heard the stories. Cherokee women raped and murdered, their bodies left in ditches, their deaths blamed on Indian savagery or simple bad luck. Justice was a concept that applied only to white men in Georgia. Everyone else was just property or pest, to be used or exterminated as convenience dictated. "Then we make them pay for the privilege," Ayanna said, meeting his eyes. "My people died running, Josiah, died begging, died trying to follow laws that were designed to kill us. I won't die that way. I won't." The dogs were closer now, their barking taking on the frenzied quality that meant they'd found a scent. Through the window, Ayanna could see movement in the trees, shadows that resolved into men on horseback, 5 of them, exactly as Josiah had said. They wore the rough clothes of frontier trackers, but their weapons were expensive, rifles that gleamed even in the filtered forest light. Pistols holstered at their hips, knives that hung from their belts like promises. "Hide," she told Josiah. her voice leaving no room for argument. "Under the floorboards, in the space you made. Hide now." "I won't leave you to—" "You will," she interrupted, "because if they take you, everything we've built dies. Everything we are dies. Your freedom dies. But if I stop them, if I buy us time, we survive. We endure. Trust me, my love. Trust me like I trusted you that first night." Something in her voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made him move. He kissed her once, hard and desperate, tasting like salt and fear and coffee. Then he dropped to the floor, pulling up the loose boards they'd prepared for exactly this moment, sliding into the darkness beneath. Ayana replaced the boards, scattered a rug and some baskets over them, and moved to stand in the center of the cabin. The tomahawk hung loose in her right hand. Her left hand opened and closed, feeling the cool October air on her palm. The dogs reached the cabin first, throwing themselves against the door, their claws scraping wood. Then came the voices. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful and nobody needs to get hurt." Ayana almost laughed. As if peace was ever an option for people like her and Josiah, as if the men outside weren't planning exactly what kind of hurt to inflict the moment they had the chance. She moved to the door, her feet silent on the packed earth floor. Took a breath, let it out slow. Then she opened the door. 5 men sat on their horses, forming a semicircle around the cabin entrance. The leader, a man with a gray beard and cold eyes the color of river ice, smiled when he saw her. "Well now," he said, "ain't you a pretty little savage? You hiding a runaway in there, girl? Big buck, strong as an ox, answers to the name of property of Mason Turner of Savannah?" "I know no one by that description," Ayana said calmly, her accent still carrying the melodic quality of Cherokee speech. "You're on Cherokee land. You should leave." The men laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Cherokee land," the leader said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Darling, there ain't no Cherokee land no more. That all got bought and paid for. You're squatting on Georgia territory, which makes you a criminal. Now we can do this easy or we can do this hard. Your choice." He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. The other 4 followed suit, spreading out, surrounding her. The dogs strained at their leashes, teeth bared, trained to see brown skin and smell danger. Ayana's fingers tightened on the tomahawk handle. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Wait for the moment when they think they've won. That's when they're most vulnerable." "Last chance, savage," the leader said, pulling a knife from his belt. "Tell us where the runaway is, and maybe we let you live. Maybe we even have some fun first, if you're nice about it." The other men laughed again. One of them was already unbuckling his belt. Ayana looked at them, really looked at them. 5 men who saw her as nothing, who saw Josiah as property, who saw love as a crime and mercy as weakness. 5 men who represented everything that had destroyed her people, who embodied the casual cruelty of a system built on stolen land and stolen bodies. "Love is not a crime," she said quietly. Then she moved. Ayana's tomahawk caught him in the throat, not the blade, but the spike on the back of the head, punching through his windpipe with the wet sound of metal entering meat. His eyes went wide with surprise, blood bubbling from his lips as he tried to scream. She yanked the weapon free, spinning away from his falling body, already tracking her next target. The dogs had gone silent, confused by the sudden violence. Their training said attack, but their instinct said flee. In that moment of canine hesitation, Ayana had her advantage. The second man was drawing his pistol, his hand fumbling at the holster. Too slow. She covered the distance between them in 3 running steps, her body low and fast. The tomahawk came down in an overhead arc, catching him at the junction where neck met shoulder. The blade bit deep, cutting through flesh and muscle and bone until it lodged against his spine. His pistol fired wild, the shot going high into the pine canopy, sending birds screaming into the sky. She left the tomahawk embedded in his body, turning to face the remaining 3 with empty hands. They'd recovered from their shock now, were reaching for weapons, spreading out to flank her. The leader, the one with the grey beard and ice eyes, had his rifle up, the barrel swinging toward her. "You red bitch!" he shouted, his face purple with rage. "You're dead! You hear me? Dead!" Ayana dove behind the corner of the cabin as his rifle cracked, the bullet chewing splinters from the doorframe where her head had been a heartbeat before. She could hear them shouting, coordinating, moving to surround the small structure. 3 men, all armed, all experienced killers who'd hunted human beings for profit. The smart thing would be to run, disappear into the forest, use her knowledge of the land to escape, let Josiah slip away when darkness fell. But Ayana had learned long ago that survival sometimes required sacrificing smart for necessary. She pressed her back against the cabin wall, breathing hard, her mind racing through possibilities. The second man's body lay 10 feet away, her father's tomahawk still lodged in his ruined shoulder. If she could reach it... Footsteps crunched through pine needles, moving around the cabin's far side, closer, closer. She could hear the man's breathing, rapid and nervous. Good. Nervous men made mistakes. Ayana dropped to her belly, crawling through the dirt and dead leaves with the silence her father had taught her. The footsteps paused, the man sensing something wrong, but not sure what. She slithered forward, making herself small, making herself invisible, until she could see his boots, expensive leather, polished to a shine that seemed obscene in the wilderness. She rolled, coming up fast, her hand closing on a fist-sized rock. His eyes widened as she materialized from the ground like a spirit. The rock caught him in the temple with a crack like breaking ice. He stumbled backward, blood streaming from his hairline, his rifle dropping from nerveless fingers. Ayana was on him before he could recover, her hands finding his own knife in its sheath. She drove it up under his ribs, angling toward the heart, putting her whole body weight behind the thrust. His breath left him in a hot rush against her face, whiskey and tobacco, and the copper tang of blood. His hands pawed weakly at her arms as she held the blade inside him, counting seconds, waiting for the light to leave his eyes. 3, she whispered as he slumped to the ground. A bullet whined past her ear, so close she felt the heat of its passage. She threw herself flat, rolling behind the dead man's body, as more shots tore through the air where she'd been standing. The body jerked with impacts, meat and blood spraying. They were shooting at their own companion's corpse, too panicked to care, too desperate to be accurate. During the pause as they reloaded, Ayana scrambled toward the second man's body, her hands closing on the tomahawk's handle. It came free with a sucking sound that would haunt quieter moments. The weight of it centered her, transformed her fear into something sharp and focused. 2 left, the leader and 1 other. "Spread out," the grey-bearded man was shouting. "Circle around. She's just 1 squaw. We've killed dozens of her kind. Move." But his voice carried an edge of hysteria now. Whatever they'd expected from this simple slave-catching mission, it wasn't a Cherokee woman who fought like a demon, who killed with the efficiency of a trained warrior. Fear was contagious, and Ayana could hear it spreading between the 2 survivors like fever. She moved through the forest that surrounded the cabin, using every tree and bush for cover, her feet finding purchase on ground she'd walked 1,000 times. This was her territory now, bought with 8 months of learning every deer trail, every hidden hollow, every place where the earth whispered its secrets. The 4th man appeared through the trees, his rifle sweeping back and forth, his eyes white-rimmed with terror. He was young, maybe 20, with a sparse beard and acne scars on his cheeks. Someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd chosen to hunt human beings for money. Ayana felt no pity. She dropped from an oak branch above him, the tomahawk leading. The blade caught him across the side of the head, the impact sending a jolt up her arms. He went down hard, his rifle discharging into the dirt. She landed on top of him, driving her knee into his chest, pinning him. His hands came up to protect his face, Too little and too late. The tomahawk rose and fell, rose and fell, rose and fell. When she stood, her arms were painted red to the elbows. The young man's face was gone, replaced by something that looked like raw butchery, like the deer carcasses she dressed in winter. She was breathing hard now, her heart hammering against her ribs, adrenaline singing through her veins like lightning. 4, she said to the watching forest. Behind her, a twig snapped. Ayana spun, raising the tomahawk, but the grey-bearded leader already had his pistol leveled at her center mass. From this distance, maybe 15 feet, he couldn't miss. They stared at each other across that small space that might as well have been an ocean. "Drop it," he said, his voice shaking but his gun hand steady. "Drop the weapon, or I put a bullet through your heart." Ayana's fingers tightened on the blood-slick handle. She could throw it. Her father had taught her that too, how to make a tomahawk spin through air and find its target. But at this range, even if she hit him, he'd still get his shot off. They'd both die, and Josiah would be left alone, hiding under floorboards, waiting for a rescue that would never come. "I said drop it!" She let the tomahawk fall to the pine needles with a soft thud. The man's shoulders sagged with relief, though his gun never wavered. "You killed 4 good men," he said. 4 men who were just doing their job, just trying to make a living. You know what they're gonna do to you for that, savage? You know what the law allows? Your law, Ayana said quietly, is written in stolen ink on stolen paper about stolen land. What do I care for the laws of thieves? His finger tightened on the trigger. Brave words for a dead woman. "At least I'll die free," she replied. "Can you say the same? Does the money spend well knowing you earned it hunting people? Do you sleep sound knowing you're a dog for hire?" "Shut up," he snarled, but she'd struck something, seen it flicker across his face. "Just shut your mouth." "My mother died free," Ayana continued, her voice growing stronger. "She died on the trail of tears, but she died knowing she'd never bowed, never broken, never become what they wanted her to be." "Can your mother say that? Or did she raise a son who hunts other men's wives for coin?" I said, "Shut up." He took a step forward, the pistol shaking now, his face contorted with rage and something that might have been shame. "You red bitch! You think you're better than—" The cabin door exploded outward. Josiah came through it like a force of nature, like a summer storm made flesh. He'd stayed hidden as long as he could stand, listening to the gunfire, the screams, the terrible sounds of violence. But hearing that man threaten Ayana, hearing the contempt and hatred in his voice, had broken whatever restraint he'd maintained. In his hands, he carried the iron poker from the fireplace, still hot from the coals. The grey-bearded man spun, trying to track this new threat, his pistol swinging from Ayana to Josiah. He got one shot off, a wild thing that went high and right, missing by a mile. Then Josiah was on him, the poker coming down like the hammer of God, striking the man's shoulder with a crack of breaking bone. The pistol flew from his hand. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. Josiah hit him again, this time in the ribs, again in the knee, again and again, each blow punctuated by the wet snap of breaking bones, the man's screams growing weaker, more desperate. "Josiah!" Ayana called. "Josiah, stop!" But he couldn't stop or wouldn't. 8 months of hiding, of fear, of knowing that men like this would never stop hunting him. It all came pouring out in a fury of iron and rage. He'd spent his whole life being told he was property, being beaten when he dared suggest otherwise, being treated as less than human. And now here was one of those men, broken and bleeding at his feet. Finally, exhausted, Josiah let the poker fall. He stood over the grey-bearded man, his chest heaving, his arms trembling with spent adrenaline. The man looked up at him with eyes already glazing over, blood bubbling from his lips. "My name," Josiah said quietly, "is Josiah. Not boy, not property, not buck. Josiah. And this woman, this brave, fierce, perfect woman, she is my wife. Not in your churches, not in your courts, but in every way that matters. Remember that when you meet whatever God you claim to worship. The man tried to speak, but only blood came out. His body shuddered once, twice, then went still. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the distant call of crows and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Ayana walked to Josiah, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the dirt. She touched his arm gently, and he flinched as if burned. "I killed them," he whispered, staring at his hands. "I killed a white man. They'll hunt me forever now. They'll never stop." "Who? They were already hunting you," Ayana said softly. "At least now they know the cost." He turned to her, and she saw tears cutting tracks through the blood spattered on his face. "You could have run," he said. "When they came, you could have disappeared into the forest. Let them take me, saved yourself. And lose the only person who makes me want to survive?" She shook her head. "No, never. We live together, or we die together, but we don't abandon each other. That's the promise we made." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with sobs he'd held back for too long. She held him. This man who'd survived horrors she could barely imagine, this man who'd chosen love over safety, this man who was hers in every way that mattered. Around them, 5 bodies lay cooling in the October air. The dogs had fled, their leashes trailing behind them as they ran for home. Soon, someone would notice these men hadn't returned. Soon more would come, better armed, more numerous. But for now, in this moment, Ayana and Josiah stood together in their clearing, surrounded by the price of their freedom. It took 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours of grim, bloody work that neither of them would ever speak about in detail. The bodies had to be moved, dragged deep into the forest where the earth was soft, and the scavengers would find them quickly. Ayana led the way, choosing places where runoff from the river had carved gullies and ditches, where fallen logs created natural barriers, where the wilderness could reclaim what civilization had sent against her. Josiah dug with a shovel they'd kept for their small garden, each thrust of the blade into dark Georgia soil, a prayer and a curse. His back ached where old scars pulled tight, where the overseer's whip had written a history of cruelty across his flesh. But the pain felt right somehow, felt like penance or payment or justice. He couldn't quite decide which. "Not too deep," Ayana said, watching from above as he worked on the 4th grave. "We want the animals to find them, want them scattered. No bodies means no proof. No proof means no crime. There's always a crime when people like us defend ourselves," Josiah replied, his voice hollow. He'd barely spoken since the violence ended, and when he did, the words came out wrong. Too flat, too distant, as if he was talking from the bottom of a well. Ayana understood. She'd felt the same thing on the Trail of Tears, after the first few deaths, when grief became too heavy to carry and the mind simply went numb. Survival required a kind of coldness, a shutting down of the parts of yourself that felt too much. You could mourn later in the quiet spaces. In the moment, you just move forward. The grey-bearded leader, the 5th man, they left for last. Ayana stripped him of everything useful, his rifle, his ammunition, his knife, a leather pouch containing $43 in coins and paper money. More money than she'd seen in years, maybe more than she'd ever held at once. Blood money, paid to hunt human beings. She split it with Josiah. "For supplies," she said, "for whatever comes next." "What does come next?" he asked, looking at the dead man's face. In death, he looked smaller somehow, less threatening. Just a grey-haired man who'd made bad choices and met a bad end. "We can't stay here. Can't go back to any Cherokee territory. What's left of it? Can't head south? North, maybe? Try to make it to one of the free states?" Ayana considered, her mind working through geography and possibility. "Pennsylvania is 500 miles. We'd have to cross the whole of Georgia, then Tennessee, then Virginia, with every bounty hunter in the South looking for descriptions of an Indian woman and a runaway slave. We wouldn't make it 50 miles, so we just wait to die?" "We go west," she said firmly, "toward the Mississippi. There's still wild country there, places where the law hasn't reached, where people don't ask questions. Creek territory, Choctaw land. They might take us in, or they might not, but at least we'd be moving away from the worst of it. Josiah nodded slowly. West, then? When? Tonight, soon as the cabins burned. They dragged the leader's body to join his companions, covering all 5 graves with loose soil and pine needles, arranging deadfall over them to look natural. In a week, the raccoons and possums would find them. In 2 weeks, the bodies would be scattered across acres of forest, bones and scraps that told no coherent story. The dogs might lead someone back to the cabin eventually, but by then there would be nothing to find except ashes and questions. The sun was touching the western horizon when they returned to the cabin for the last time. Ayanna moved through the single room, gathering what little they could carry, her basket of herbs, 2 blankets, a fire-starting kit, a cooking pot, dried venison wrapped in cloth. Everything else, the table Josiah had built, the chair she'd woven from river cane, the bed they'd shared on 8 months of nights both tender and desperate, all of it would burn. Wait, Josiah said, and crossed to the corner where his blacksmith tools hung. He selected a small hammer, barely larger than a hand axe, and tucked it into his belt. Might need to trade this, or use it. Either way. Ayanna picked up her father's tomahawk, wiping the blade clean on a scrap of cloth, checking the edge with her thumb. Still sharp, still true. She murmured a prayer in Cherokee, asking forgiveness from the weapon for using it to take human life, thanking it for keeping faith with her in the moment of need. Then she pulled out the knife she'd taken from the 3rd man and began carving letters into the doorframe, slow, deliberate strokes that cut deep into the wood. The letters were shaky, unpracticed. She'd learned to read and write only recently, taught by a missionary who'd shown unexpected kindness before the removal. But the words were clear enough. Love is not a crime. Josiah stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. They won't see it that way, he said. They'll say we're murderers, savages, threats to civilization. Let them, Ayanna replied. The forest knows the truth. The river knows, the land knows, and that's enough. She struck the flint against steel, sending sparks into a pile of dry pine needles they'd heaped in the cabin's center. The flames caught quickly, spreading across the floor, climbing the walls, reaching for the roof with hungry orange fingers. They stood outside, watching their home become a pyre, watching 8 months of fragile peace turn to smoke and ash. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming everything. The heat drove them back into the tree line, where they stood with their meager supplies, watching the only place they'd ever been happy together disappear into flames and memory. I loved that cabin, Josiah said quietly. Loved what it meant. A place that was ours. A place where I could just be a man, and you could just be a woman, and none of the rest of it mattered. We'll build another, Ayanna said, though she didn't quite believe it. The world had a way of crushing things like hope, like love between people it deemed incompatible. But hope was all they had now, so she clung to it with both hands. Somewhere so far from here they'll never find us. Somewhere the law is just words on paper that never reach. As full darkness fell, they turned their backs on the burning cabin and began walking west. The forest closed around them like a living thing, full of sounds and shadows and the whisper of night wind through pine branches. Somewhere behind them, the fire collapsed in on itself, sending a column of sparks spiraling into the October sky. They walked through the night, following deer trails and game paths that Ayanna knew by heart. Josiah had a strong sense of direction, could navigate by stars when they showed through the canopy, and between them they maintained a steady pace. Not running. Running would make noise, leave obvious tracks. Just walking with purpose, putting distance between themselves and the place where 5 men had died. Near midnight, they heard the first sounds of pursuit. Dogs baying in the distance, excited and furious. Horses crashing through undergrowth, men shouting coordinates and directions. Someone had found the cabin ruins sooner than expected, or the dogs had tracked their trail from where they'd scattered the bodies. Either way, the hunt had begun again. "We need water," Ayana said urgently. "Need to break the scent trail." They altered course, angling north toward the Chattahoochee River. It was risky. The river would slow them down, and crossing it safely in darkness was nearly impossible. But dogs couldn't track across running water, and right now the dogs were their biggest threat. They reached the riverbank as the moon rose, casting silver light across the moving water. The Chattahoochee was wide here, maybe 50 yards across, the current strong from recent rains upriver. Ayana stripped off her dress and moccasins, bundling them with their supplies to keep dry. Josiah did the same with his rough spun shirt and pants. "I'm not a strong swimmer," he admitted, looking at the dark water with obvious fear. "The plantation where I was born, we weren't allowed near water. They said we might try to escape by river." "I am," Ayana replied, taking his hand. "Hold on to me. Trust me." They waded in together, the cold water stealing their breath. The current grabbed at them immediately, trying to sweep them downstream. But Ayana knew rivers the way she knew forests. She angled across the flow, using its strength rather than fighting it, letting it carry them diagonally toward the far bank. Halfway across, Josiah's grip tightened painfully. Can't touch bottom." "Don't try," she said calmly, though her heart was pounding. "Just hold on. Let the water carry you. We're almost there." The dog's baying grew louder behind them, closer. She could see lights now through the trees on the bank they'd abandoned. Torches, maybe a dozen of them, spreading out along the shore. More slave catchers, or maybe a proper militia. Either way, it meant death if they were caught. Ayana kicked harder, pulling Josiah along, her arms burning with effort. The far bank seemed to retreat with every stroke, but she knew that was illusion, knew they were making progress, even if it felt impossible. Behind them, the lights reached the exact spot where they'd entered the water. "There!" someone shouted. "In the river! I see them!" A rifle cracked, the bullet smacking into the water 20 feet to their left. More shots followed, stitching the surface with white splashes. Ayana dove, pulling Josiah under, using the water itself as cover. They surfaced 15 yards downstream, gasping, their ears ringing from the pressure and the gunfire. Then Josiah's feet found bottom. He pulled them both toward the far bank, stumbling through the shallows, hauling them up onto the muddy shore. More shots rang out, but they were in the trees now, invisible in the darkness, and the river was too wide for accurate shooting. They ran. Dripping wet, half-naked, carrying their bundled possessions, they ran through Georgia wilderness like ghosts fleeing dawn. Behind them, the shouting grew frustrated, then angry, then faded as the slave catchers realized their quarry had escaped. For now. Miles passed beneath their feet. Ayana's lungs burned. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she kept moving. Beside her, Josiah ran with the desperate strength of a man who'd spent his whole life knowing that stopping meant capture, that capture meant death or worse. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they finally slowed, collapsing in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline crash. But they were alive, they were together, and they were free. "How far you think we came?" Josiah asked when he could speak again. 10 miles, maybe 12, Ayana replied. "Not enough, never enough, but it's a start." He pulled her close, wrapping one of the blankets around both of them, sharing warmth. Through the trees, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. A new day, a new beginning, or another chapter in a story that might not have a happy ending. "I'm sorry," Josiah whispered into her hair. "Sorry you had to kill for me. Sorry I brought this down on you." "You didn't bring anything," Ayana replied firmly. "I chose you, chose this. And I'd choose it again, every time. Now rest. We have miles to go before we're truly safe." They dozed fitfully as the sun climbed higher, taking turns keeping watch, listening for sounds of pursuit. But the forest around them remained quiet except for birdsong and the rustle of squirrels in the canopy above. Perhaps the slave catchers had given up, or perhaps they were regrouping, preparing for a more organized hunt. Either way, Ayana knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. They'd killed 5 men, had declared war on the entire system that tried to own Josiah and erase her people. There would be consequences. There would be more violence. There would be suffering and loss, and moments when death seemed preferable between probably and certainly, that narrow space where hope lived. 500 miles, she said aloud. We've come 23 already, Josiah replied. What's 477 more? They walked into the rising sun, 2 small figures against the vast Georgia wilderness, invisible to everyone except those who knew how to see, how to hope, how to believe that love, real love, the kind worth killing and dying for, was stronger than any law written by men who'd never known what it meant to be truly free. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose before them like a promise written in stone and sky, their peaks shrouded in the November mist that gave them their name. Ayana and Josiah had been traveling for 47 days, covering nearly 300 miles through Georgia, crossing into Tennessee, then angling northeast into the foothills of Virginia. They'd become creatures of twilight and shadow, moving in the hours when honest people slept, hiding during daylight in barns and caves and hollow trees. The pursuit had never stopped. 3 times they'd heard dogs in the distance. Twice they'd seen militia patrols from their hiding spots. Once they'd watched from a ridgeline as a group of men, 20 strong, armed with rifles and determination, passed below them so close that Ayana could see the steam of their breath in the cold morning air. But they were still alive, still free, still together. The mountains had changed things. The land was rougher here, harder to traverse, but also harder to search. Forests grew thick with laurel and rhododendron that created natural barriers, and the steep terrain favored those on foot over those on horseback. For the first time since leaving their burned cabin, Ayana felt like they might actually reach the dismal swamp, might actually make it to a place where they could stop running. "How much farther?" Josiah asked, as they picked their way down a rocky slope, their breath misting in the November cold. He'd lost weight during their journey, they both had, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. But his eyes still burned with determination, and his hand never strayed far from the small hammer at his belt. 200 miles, maybe a bit less, Ayana replied. She'd been marking their progress by the position of the stars, by landmarks Sarah had described, by instinct and hope. If we can cross the Blue Ridge, get into the Piedmont country, we'll be close. And if they're waiting for us, if they figured out where we're heading, then we fight, she said simply, touching the tomahawk that hung at her waist. Her father's weapon had become an extension of her body during their journey, its weight as familiar as her own heartbeat. Or we die. But we don't go back. Never back. They'd had this conversation before, in different words, in moments when exhaustion made them doubt. But the answer was always the same, forward or death. Those were the only options that made sense. Near dusk, as they sought shelter for the coming night, they heard music. It drifted through the mountains like smoke, a fiddle playing a tune that Ayana didn't recognize, but that made Josiah freeze in his tracks. "That's Cotton-Eyed Joe," he whispered. "Dance music means there's people nearby, white people most likely." They crept closer, following the sound to a small valley where a cabin sat in a cleared space, smoke rising from its chimney. Outside, a group of people, maybe 10 or 12, were gathered around a fire, passing a jug, dancing to the fiddler's tune. Poor whites, by the look of them, mountain folk who scratched out a living from thin soil and hunting. "We should go around," Ayana said. But Josiah was staring at the cabin, at the smoke, at the people who looked warm and fed and safe. "I'm so tired," he said quietly. "Tired of running, tired of being cold, tired of living like an animal." He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that frightened her. A kind of surrender, a willingness to accept whatever came rather than keep fighting. Maybe these mountain folk, maybe they wouldn't turn us in, maybe they'd help. Or maybe they'd collect that $500 reward and dance while they wait for the militia, Ayana countered. Josiah, you know we can't trust anyone, especially not white people. I know, he said, but he didn't move away from the clearing. Kept watching those people around their fire, their music and laughter drifting through the cold evening air. Ayana was about to pull him away when one of the dancers, a young woman with red hair and a homespun dress, looked directly at them. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the distance. Then the woman did something unexpected. She smiled, put a finger to her lips, and gestured toward the back of the cabin. "Trap," Ayana hissed. But Josiah was already moving, drawn by the possibility of warmth and rest, like a moth to flame. Ayana cursed under her breath and followed, her hand on her tomahawk, ready to kill if necessary. The red-haired woman met them behind the cabin, away from the fire and the other people. Up close, she was younger than Ayana had first thought, maybe 17, with a face that had seen its share of hardship, but hadn't been broken by it. "You're them," she said without preamble. "The Cherokee woman and the runaway. Been hearing about you for weeks. They say you killed 5 slave catchers with just a tomahawk." "They say a lot of things," Ayana replied carefully. "Most of it lies." "Maybe, but you're here, and you're running, and that means something to folks like us." She glanced back at the cabin, then looked at them again. "My daddy, he don't hold with slavery, says it's a sin and an abomination, lost his brother in a cotton mill down south, worked to death for nothing while rich men got richer. So when I tell him about you, he'll help, but you gotta be quiet about it. Some of the others, they're poor enough to be tempted by that reward money." "Why should we trust you?" Josiah asked. The woman shrugged. "Because you don't have a choice. Because winter's coming, and you won't survive it in the mountains without shelter. And because," she paused, her eyes softening, "because I got a sister who ran off with a Cherokee man 2 years back. Ain't heard from her since. I like to think that if they're out there somewhere running like you are, someone's helping them. Figure I owe the universe for that." She led them to a small root cellar, similar to the one they'd hidden back in Georgia, told them to wait there while she fetched her father. It was a risk, a huge risk. But Josiah was right about one thing: they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they'd need help. Eventually, they'd have to trust someone. The woman's father turned out to be a lean, weathered man named Thomas, who looked at them with eyes that held more curiosity than judgment. He brought them food, real food, hot cornbread and stew that made Ayana want to cry, and listened to their story without interrupting. "Dismal swamp, you say," he mused when they'd finished. "That's ambitious, but it might work. Lot of folks hiding there, from what I hear. Might could even trade with towns nearby, since the swamp's so big nobody can police all of it." He scratched his beard, thinking, "I can give you supplies. Food, blankets, maybe a better coat for the woman. She's near freezing in that dress. But I can't let you stay more than a night. Too dangerous for my family if someone comes looking." "1 night is more than we expected," Josiah said gratefully. "Thank you." They spent that night in the root cellar, wrapped in borrowed blankets, their stomachs full for the first time in weeks. Above them, they could hear the party continuing, the fiddle music, the laughter, the sounds of people who were poor but free, who didn't have to hide or run or constantly check their backs for pursuers. "I want that," Josiah said quietly in the darkness. "Want to be able to laugh again, to dance, to just exist without fear." "We'll have it," Ayana promised. "In the swamp or somewhere else. But we'll have it." "You really believe that?" She considered lying, considered offering him false hope. But they'd been through too much for lies. I believe we'll fight for it. That's all anyone can do. Fight for what they want and hope the world doesn't crush them in the process. He pulled her closer, and they lay together listening to the music filter down through the floorboards. Two fugitives dreaming of a future that probably didn't exist, but that they'd pursue anyway. Because what else was there? At dawn, Thomas woke them with more food and a pack filled with supplies: dried meat, cornmeal, a real winter coat for Ayanna, a length of rope, a small tarp they could use for shelter. There's a station on the Underground Railroad about 50 miles northeast of here, he said, sketching a crude map in the dirt floor. Old Quaker couple runs it. Tell them Thomas from Poplar Cove sent you. They'll know what that means. How do you know about the Underground Railroad? Ayanna asked. Thomas smiled grimly. Because I've helped run it for 10 years. My wife died from a sickness she caught from a slave woman we were hiding. Woman had pneumonia, gave it to my Mary, and neither of them made it. Some folks would have stopped helping after that. But I figure Mary died doing what she thought was right, and stopping would dishonor her memory. Ayanna felt her throat tighten. All this time, she'd thought they were alone, that the whole world was against them. But here was proof that resistance existed everywhere, that people of conscience were fighting in their own ways, that love and decency could survive even in systems designed to destroy them. They left as the sun rose, moving quickly through the mountain forests, following Thomas's directions toward the Quaker station. Behind them, the party had finally ended, and the valley was quiet except for birdsong and the whisper of wind through bare branches. For 3 days, they traveled without incident, making good time through relatively flat terrain. Then, on the 4th morning, they found the station, or what was left of it. The farmhouse had been burned, recently by the look of it. The walls still stood, but the roof was gone, and smoke stains marked the windows like bruises. In the yard, 2 graves had been hastily dug, marked with simple wooden crosses. The Quakers, Josiah said, his voice hollow. They found them. Killed them for helping people like us. Ayanna felt rage and grief warring in her chest. She didn't know these people's names, had never met them, but they died, fighting the same system that wanted her and Josiah dead or enslaved. They died as allies in a war most people pretended wasn't happening. We need to keep moving, she said finally. Whoever did this might still be close. But as they turned to leave, a voice called out from the barn, "Wait!" They spun, weapons drawn, ready to fight or flee. From the shadows emerged a boy, maybe 12 years old, skinny and filthy, with wild eyes that spoke of recent trauma. "Don't leave," he begged. "Please. They killed my parents, said they were making an example. Said anyone who helps runaways is a traitor. I've been hiding for 2 days, waiting for someone to come." Ayanna and Josiah exchanged glances. Taking the boy would slow them down, make them more visible, increase their risk exponentially. But leaving him meant leaving him to starve or freeze or be found by whoever had murdered his parents. "What's your name?" Ayanna asked gently. "Samuel," the boy replied. "Samuel Price, and I know you're running. I know people are after you, but I can help. I know these roads, know where the safe houses are, know which towns to avoid. My parents, they taught me everything about the railroad before." His voice broke. Before. Josiah looked at Ayanna. She saw the question in his eyes. What do we do? She thought about her own family, dead on the Trail of Tears. Thought about the cruelty of leaving children to face horrors alone. Thought about the kind of people she and Josiah wanted to be, even in the midst of running for their lives. "You can come with us," she said, "to the dismal swamp. But you have to keep up, and you can't slow us down. If we tell you to hide, you hide. If we tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Samuel nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his dirty face. "I understand. I'll do whatever you say. I just can't stay here, can't stay with them." They buried Samuel's parents properly, marking their graves with stones and prayers. Then they gathered what supplies remained in the barn and continued north, now 3 fugitives instead of 2, bound together by tragedy and hope, and the desperate belief that somewhere ahead was a place where they could stop running. The militia caught up to them 5 days later. The morning broke cold and clear over the Virginia Piedmont, frost painting the world in shades of silver and white. Ayana woke first, as she always did, her body trained by weeks of flight to sleep lightly and wake at the slightest unusual sound. But this morning, the sound that woke her wasn't slight at all. Dogs. Multiple dogs, their baying carried on the wind from the south, and beneath that sound, the thunder of horses, many horses moving fast. "Josiah!" She shook him awake, already reaching for her tomahawk. "They found us! Move!" Samuel jerked awake with a cry of fear. The boy had been having nightmares every night since they'd found him at his burned home, and each morning he woke looking more haunted than the last. But there was no time for gentleness now. They abandoned their small camp without bothering to hide it. The dogs would find it anyway, would mark the scent and continue pursuit. Instead, they ran north toward the dismal swamp that was still, according to Samuel's knowledge, maybe 3 days away if they pushed hard. 3 days they didn't have. The sounds of pursuit grew closer with terrifying speed. The militia, and it had to be militia, no simple slave-catching party would travel with this many men, had clearly picked up their trail and were closing the distance between them like wolves running down deer. "There!" Samuel pointed toward a rocky outcropping maybe half a mile ahead. "Caves in those rocks. We could hide. Wait them out." "Caves are traps," Josiah panted as they ran. "They corner you, smoke you out, you die." "So what do we do?" the boy asked, his voice cracking with terror. Ayana's mind raced through possibilities. They couldn't outrun horses, couldn't hide with dogs tracking them. Fighting was suicide against 20 or 30 armed men, which left exactly one option, one desperate, probably fatal option that at least gave them a chance. "We split up," she said. "Samuel, you're the smallest and lightest. Take the high ground, climb into those rocks where horses can't follow, hide until they pass. Josiah and I will lead them away, draw them north. When they're gone, you head for the swamp, find the Maroons, tell them what happened." "No," Josiah said flatly. "We don't split up. That's how people die. That's how we lose each other. We're going to die anyway if we stay together." Ayana grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "But if Samuel makes it, if he tells our story, then something survives. Something of what we fought for continues." The dogs were close enough now that she could hear individual animals, could pick out the sound of their paws hitting earth. Maybe 2 minutes, 3 at most, before the militia had visual contact. Samuel was crying, understanding what was being asked of him. "I don't want to leave you. You saved me. You're like my family now." Ayana pulled him into a fierce hug. "Then honor your family by surviving, by living, by remembering us." She pushed him toward the rocks. "Run. Now." "Don't look back." The boy ran, his small form disappearing into the boulder field, climbing with the desperate agility of youth. Ayana and Josiah turned north and kept moving, making as much noise as possible, leaving an obvious trail for the dogs to follow. They ran for another 10 minutes, their lungs burning, their legs screaming protest. Then the forest opened into a clearing, and they realized they'd made a terrible mistake. The clearing was surrounded on 3 sides by dense thickets of thorns and brambles, impenetrable without cutting through, which would take time they didn't have. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder by the second. They were trapped, caught between obstacles and enemy, with no good options remaining. "Well," Josiah said, pulling out his small hammer, "at least we'll go down fighting." Ayana raised her tomahawk, feeling the weight of her father's weapon one last time. Around them, the morning sun painted everything in gold, making the world beautiful even as it became their killing ground. She thought about her mother, frozen on the trail of tears, about her sisters, buried in Cherokee earth, about the cabin she and Josiah had built together, the brief happiness they'd found in the wilderness. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he replied. Then the first dogs burst from the tree line. They were massive animals, bloodhounds bred for tracking and trained for violence, their teeth bared, their eyes focused with predatory intensity. Ayana's tomahawk caught the first one in the skull, dropping it instantly. Josiah's hammer crushed the second one's spine, but there were more, 6, 8, 10, and behind them came the men. The militia poured into the clearing on horseback, 27 strong, armed with rifles and pistols and the absolute confidence of superior numbers. They formed a semicircle around Ayana and Josiah, guns raised, faces showing mixture of triumph and fury. Their leader, a colonel by his uniform, urged his horse forward. He was a heavy man with mutton-chop sideburns and cold eyes that evaluated them like livestock. "Well," he said, his Virginia accent thick and contemptuous, "looks like the hunt is over. The Cherokee savage and her pet nigger finally cornered." "My name," Ayana said clearly, "is Ayana, and this man is Josiah. We are not savage. We are not property. We are human beings fighting for our freedom." The colonel laughed, a sound like rocks falling. "Human beings, that's rich. You killed 5 men, 5 white men who were just doing their duty, just enforcing the law. You think that makes you freedom fighters? You're murderers, terrorists, and now you'll pay the price." "The price," Josiah said quietly, "was already paid. Paid by my people in chains, paid by her people on the Trail of Tears. Paid by every person who's been murdered by your law for the crime of wanting to live free. So yes, we killed 5 men. And I'd kill 500 more if it meant other people wouldn't have to suffer what we've suffered." The colonel's face darkened. "String them up," he ordered his men, "right here. Let the bodies hang as a warning to any other runaways or savages who think they can defy Southern law." Ropes were produced. 2 men dismounted, approaching with the casual cruelty of those who'd done this before. Ayana and Josiah backed toward each other, their weapons raised, knowing this was the end, but determined to make it count for something. Then a shot rang out, not from the militia, but from the boulder field where Samuel had hidden. The shot went wild, hitting nothing, but it created a moment of chaos, men ducking, horses shying, attention diverted. In that moment, Ayana and Josiah moved. Ayana threw her tomahawk with all the strength she had left. It spun through the air, the morning sun glinting off steel, and embedded itself in the colonel's chest. He looked down at it with an expression of surprise, then toppled backward off his horse. Josiah charged the dismounted men, his hammer crushing the first one's skull before anyone could react. Then hands were on him, dragging him down, and Ayana was fighting too, kicking, biting, clawing, but there were too many of them, far too many, and eventually they were subdued, held face down in the dirt, while men tied their hands behind their backs. From the rocks, Samuel fired again, but this time someone had pinpointed his location. Return fire chewed into the boulders around him. The boy scrambled away, disappearing deeper into the rocky maze, and after a moment the militia stopped shooting, apparently deciding one boy wasn't worth the effort of pursuit. A new leader emerged from the militia ranks, a younger man with the lieutenant's insignia. He looked at the colonel's body, at the 8 dead men from the original cabin massacre, plus the 2 Josiah had just killed. At the overall carnage this one Cherokee woman and her runaway slave had created. "This ends now," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "No trial, no transport. We hang them here and be done with it." Ropes were looped over tree branches. Nooses were tied with practiced efficiency. Ayana and Josiah were hauled to their feet, hands still bound, and positioned beneath the ropes. She could feel the rough hemp against her neck, could see Josiah beside her, his face bruised but his eyes still burning with defiance. "Any last words?" the lieutenant asked. Ayana thought about all the things she could say. Curses, prayers, defiant speeches, but in the end, she just turned to Josiah and smiled. "Worth it," she said. "Every moment. Worth it." "Worth it," he agreed. The lieutenant raised his hand to signal the execution, but before he could drop it, something extraordinary happened. From the forest to the north came a sound like nothing Ayana had ever heard, a war cry in dozens of voices, followed by a hail of gunfire. The militia wheeled their horses, confused and alarmed, trying to identify this new threat. Then figures emerged from the trees, 50 or more of them, armed with rifles and pistols and makeshift weapons. The Maroons, the free people of the dismal swamp, had come. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The militia, caught by surprise and demoralized by weeks of chasing two fugitives through hostile terrain, broke almost immediately. Some tried to fight, but most simply fled, abandoning their leaders, their prisoners, their horses, in a desperate scramble to escape. The Maroons cut down those who stayed and let those who fled go, apparently satisfied with routing the militia, rather than pursuing a complete slaughter. In 5 minutes it was over, the clearing filling with smoke and the moans of wounded men. A woman approached Ayana and Josiah, tall, dark-skinned, with scars on her face that spoke of old violence survived. She cut their bonds with a knife, removed the nooses from their necks. "We're from the swamp," she said unnecessarily. "Got word from the boy, the one hiding in the rocks. He found us yesterday, told us which way you were heading, said you'd saved his life. Figured we owed you the favor returned." Ayana stared at her, unable to process what was happening. "Samuel? He's safe?" "Safe as anyone gets in this world. He's back at our settlement now, eating like he ain't seen food in a year." The woman grinned. "Name's Dinah. I'm what passes for leadership in the swamp, and you're the Cherokee woman and the runaway who've been making the whole South lose their minds. Welcome to freedom." Behind them, Samuel emerged from the rocks, running toward them with tears streaming down his face. He crashed into Ayana with enough force to nearly knock her over, his thin arms wrapping around her waist. "You're alive," he sobbed. "I thought, when I heard the shots, we're alive," she confirmed, hugging him back. "Thanks to you. You saved us, Samuel. You and these people." Dinah gestured toward the north. "We should move before more militia come. The swamp is a day's walk. You'll be safe there. Not comfortable, mind you. Swamp living ain't easy, but safe, free, and that's worth more than comfort." They walked north through the afternoon and into the night, a group of 60 fugitives returning to their hidden home. Along the way, others told their stories. Slaves who'd escaped decades ago, free blacks who'd chosen swamp life over constant fear in towns, even a handful of white people who'd been outlaws or outcasts and found acceptance in the wild places. At dawn, they reached the edge of the dismal swamp, a vast expanse of wetland and cypress trees, of black water and green mystery, of a landscape too harsh and unpredictable for most people to control. And hidden within it, built on raised platforms and floating islands, was a community. Not large, maybe 200 people total, but real. Families lived here, children played here, crops grew in small gardens on the few patches of solid ground. It wasn't paradise. The mosquitoes were vicious, disease was common, winters were brutal, but it was free. Ayana and Josiah stood at the edge of the settlement, looking at this impossible place, this refuge carved from wilderness, by people who'd been told they had no right to exist. Samuel stood between them, each of his hands holding one of theirs. "Is this it?" the boy asked. "Is this where we stop running?" "This is it," Josiah said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is home." They built a small cabin on one of the raised platforms, just big enough for 3. Samuel took to swamp life quickly, learning to fish and trap, making friends with the other children who lived there. Ayana taught women in the settlement the Cherokee methods she knew, which plants could heal, which could harm, how to move silently through terrain that tried to swallow you. Josiah set up a forge on one of the larger islands, using scavenged metal to make tools and weapons for the community. His hands, which had once been forced to make chains for other men's captivity, now made things that supported freedom. Word of their survival spread slowly through the underground networks. Sarah, the woman from the Georgia plantation, got word 6 months later and wept with joy. teaching her people a new verse to steal away to Jesus that celebrated the Cherokee woman and her husband who'd made it north. Thomas from Poplar Cove heard and sent supplies through intermediaries. Across the south, the enslaved whispered their names like prayers. The militia never came to the swamp. A few brave souls tried, but the Maroons knew the terrain, knew how to make the wetland itself a weapon. Those who entered with hostile intent rarely left at all, their bodies swallowed by black water and soft mud. Years passed. Samuel grew into a young man, eventually leaving the swamp to work with the Underground Railroad, helping others find the freedom he'd been given. Ayanna and Josiah grew old together, their hair graying, their bodies marked by the hard life they'd chosen. But they were together, they were free. And every night, when Josiah held Ayanna in their small cabin, with swamp sounds filling the darkness around them, they remembered the 5 men who'd come to take their freedom, the massacre in the clearing, the price they'd paid for love. On quiet mornings, when mist rose from the black water and made the whole swamp look like a dream, Ayanna would take her father's tomahawk, cleaned and cared for but never used again, and carve marks into a cypress tree near their cabin. 5 marks, 1 for each life she'd taken, not with pride, not with shame, but simply as a record. A reminder that freedom cost blood, that love sometimes required violence, that survival meant becoming something other than what they'd hoped to be. Visitors sometimes asked about the marks, asked if she regretted the killing. Ayanna would think about that before answering, remembering the grey-bearded man's surprise as he died, remembering the young man's face dissolving beneath her tomahawk, remembering the weight of taking human life. "I regret that the world made it necessary," she would say. "But I don't regret keeping us alive. I don't regret choosing love over law, survival over surrender. And if I had to do it again, if they came tomorrow and threatened what we've built, I'd make the same choice, every time." Some called her savage. The enslaved called her salvation. The swamp simply called her Ayanna, eternal blossom, who'd killed 5 men with a tomahawk and lived to tell about it, who'd walked through hell with the man she loved and emerged on the other side still holding his hand. And in the dismal swamp, where freedom grew like cypress trees from black water, that was enough. Their story became legend, shared in whispers and songs, a reminder that love, real love, the kind worth fighting for, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Not because it made you weak, but because it made you willing to do anything, risk everything, become whoever you needed to become, to protect what mattered most. The 5 slave catchers had learned that lesson too late. Their blood soaking into Georgia soil, their names forgotten while Ayanna's rang through the decades like a bell calling people to remember that some things, freedom, dignity, love, were worth any price, even the price written in blood and counted in bodies. Even the price of becoming what the world called savage, when savage just meant refusing to die quietly, refusing to accept that some lives mattered more than others, refusing to believe that the laws of men were more sacred than the laws of the human heart. In the end, that's what the story was about. Not violence for its own sake, but the terrible mathematics of survival in a world built on cruelty. The simple equation that said some things were worth killing for. Some things were worth dying for. And love, true love, the kind that saw another person's full humanity and chose to honor it no matter the cost, was both. The pine forests of Georgia still grow over the places where 5 men died. The Chattahoochee River still runs, carrying away secrets and blood and the memory of a cabin that burned rather than surrender. And somewhere in those woods, carved into the bark of a tree that's grown thick